Today we're going to be taking a look at the Land Raider on steroids, that is the Spartan assault tank from Forge World. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So in this video we're doing another Space Marine Forge World review. We'll be taking a look at the datasheet for the Relic Spartan tank, any obvious buffs and synergies in combination with the various Space Marine chapters, and how I would look to use one in game. In the background, the Spartan assault tank is a large heavy transport designed during the Great Crusade for the express purpose of carrying Terminators into battle. It's essentially an up-armoured and more powerful version of the Land Raider with a larger transport capacity. It was originally developed for a specific purpose, to cross the lethal plasma defence systems of the Ring of Death surrounding the city of Ares Primus on Mars, the new design proving up to the challenge and able to stand the onslaught. The Spartans used in the 41st millennium sports twin hull-mounted heavy bolters in a similar vein to the Land Raider, but instead of having twin las cannons on the side, they have even deadlier quad las cannons. They're able to transport 25 Space Marines into battle, and some chapters still have the capacity to deploy these, such as the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions, where it's particularly popular with chapters with access to a large amount of Terminator armour. So let's see what this thing can do on the tabletop then, with a look at its datasheet. So the Relic Spartan is a Lord of War for Codex Space Marines, and we can see its datasheet here. Credit to Warpedia for the excellent datasheet. It is a fairly expensive beast as it stands. It's 497 points, when it's armed with a twin heavy bolter, 2 quad las cannons, and its crushing tracks. It's got a fairly beefy profile as you'd expect. Its movement is 10 inches, weapon skill 5, ballistic skill 3+, strength and toughness of 8, 20 wounds, 8 attacks, leadership 9 and a 2+ save. Unfortunately it doesn't have any additional protection in terms of invulnerable saves or anything. So in general fairly similar to the standard Land Raider, with a couple of extra wounds and weapon skill 5+. Those crushing tracks are a nice little addition though. They strike at strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3, and they'll be hitting on weapon skill 5, meaning that you can usually expect 2 or 3 hits from this each time it fights, meaning that it's nowhere near as non-threatening as a Land Raider is when it gets to melee. The quad las cannon and twin heavy bolter are exactly what you'd expect, and you do have some options. You can replace the quad las cannons with laser destroyers. These are the same ones that you can find on the rapier platforms. They're 36-inch range heavy one-shots, with strength 12, AP -4 and damage D6, and if you do get damage through, then you roll another dice, and you might be able to get even more additional damage through afterwards. You roll a dice and on a 3 to 5, its damage characteristic turns to 2d6, and on a 6 it increases to 3d6. Now you do save a little bit of points by downgrading to the laser destroyers. They're 20 points cheaper than the quad las cannons, meaning that one with laser destroyers would only be 457 points. However, their damage output is far less than the quad las cannons are. The laser destroyers average 2.8 wounds on a standard toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, where the quad las cannons average over 5, so they both have a far greater damage output and are far more reliable than the single shot of the laser destroyer. That has a very good chance of doing absolutely nothing in any one turn. I'd always stick with those massive quad las cannons. You can opt to replace the twin heavy bolter with a twin heavy flamer, which to be honest I find a little bit limiting. I think I'd rather have the reliable 6 shots at long range, particularly as it can move and shoot without suffering penalty for heavy weapons. On top of all this, it can also be equipped with a pintle mounted weapon, either a heavy bolter, heavy flamer, multi-melter or storm bolter. I'd most certainly take one of these, as it's a fairly big tough platform that you should be getting a few rounds of shooting out of it, and to be honest I'd be fairly happy with taking any one of these. It just depends whether you want a little bit more extra anti-infantry fire or anti-tank fire in your list. The closer range options aren't quite as bad as normal, as this thing doesn't really mind closing the distance with the enemy anywhere near as much as most tanks do. In terms of special rules, it has the Angels of Death for those combat doctrines, which already help out in the Devastator one, and it gets shock assault, so it should be up to 9 attacks for an average of 3 hits with those crushing tracks if it gets to melee. It has the chance to explode if it drops to 0 wounds, and on a 6 then it has a really big explosion with 2d6 inches for d6 mortal wounds. You really don't want this thing going up in your own lines, so I'd save yourself a command point reroll for this, just in case it does go down in flames in the enemy shooting phase. Like all standard Land Raiders, it has power of the machine spirit, which means it doesn't suffer the penalty for moving and firing with heavy weapons, always important on a big unit like this. It has smoke launchers should you want to use them, and it has steel behemoth, which frankly is the most useful rule that it has, which means that it can fall back in the movement phase and still shoot and charge during the controlling player's turn. On top of this, it can also fire its heavy weapons when it's in close combat, so basically the enemy is actually going to have to destroy the thing if it wants to shot those quad las cannons up. This is such a great rule to have for a big heavy assault transport, and it's a real shame that the Land Raider doesn't have something at least similar to this, as it does mean that it can fulfill its intended purpose, trundle forwards full of infantry, and keep up the firepower without having to worry about being attacked by an odd grot. In terms of that transport capacity, as we mentioned before, it can transport 25 chapter infantry, and each Terminator and jump pack model takes up the space of 2 models, and each Centurion takes up the space of 3. Sadly, like most of these, it can't transport Primaris. That is a seriously big transport capacity though, and it does mean that if you have a threat that wants to be jumping out in the midfield, then this is a pretty reasonable battlefield bunker to put them in, ready to unleash themselves on the enemy in the following turn. So overall, the Spartan assault tank is very similar to the Land Raider. It isn't significantly tougher, but it is significantly shootier, and it doubles down on this by having the steel behemoth, which keeps it shooting at all times. It can also transport more than the Land Raider, which means that you can put a significant amount of your army in it, should you so wish. So let's talk a little bit more about getting more out of this thing on the table then. In terms of chapter buffs, a few ones certainly stick out. Iron Hands is always excellent for vehicles, as they degrade slower and also have the 6+ Feel No Pain, and better Overwatch as well. They've got plenty of synergy with putting vehicles back together, and this guy's a pretty epic target for the Ironstone as well, which means between that and his already decent save and number of wounds, it's going to take a lot of shooting for your enemy to bring down. I would bear in mind with these chapter traits though, that he's not going to get them if he's just in his own super or heavy auxiliary detachment. He would have to include them in a supreme command one if he wanted to get the benefit of the chapter traits. For Raven Guard, if you can get the traits, then the cover is useful. For White Scars, it could be quite handy as an assault transport for slower units such as Assault Centurions for example. Salamanders have some excellent spells for defending super heavy units, such as being able to get +1 toughness and -1 to hit through their psychic powers, as well as their excellent stratagem for getting +1 to wound, which could be great for helping out those las cannons pop some tanks. Imperial Fists can certainly help out with Ignore's cover and get some bonus damage against vehicles turn 1. Black Templars could definitely make use of him as a big transport for Crusader squads or other close combat units hiding inside it, and they do have the potential to get it a 4+ Invul save with a relic for a turn. Blood Angels could again use it as an assault transport, which could be pretty handy for making Foot Death Company a little bit more viable, although there wouldn't be anything to stop you from hiding a big unit of jump pack people inside it either. Space Wolves are pretty similar in that nature. They could use it to get a lot of Marines a lot closer to the enemy, and you could have a lot of combat nastiness hiding inside it for a turn or two. For Dark Angels, you could perhaps get it to be -1 to hit with a Dark Shroud, and have the potential for hiding some Deathwing Knights or something in it if you didn't want to deep strike them onto the board. In terms of character support, large Lords of War are usually pretty decent targets for rerolls, and this thing in particular will love Chapter Master rerolls, as they'll actually make it significantly more hitty in close combat as well. Chaplain Listeners are also extra efficient on big units like this, so you could be getting +1 to hit or +1 to wound through that. And you could use some Librarian spells such as those Salamanders ones that we've mentioned, or make it just that little bit tougher with Might of Heroes. As always, Tech Marines can repair it, and using the Master of Machines and Master of the Forge combo can also allow you to have it hitting on 2s all game. Tech Marines certainly work pretty well with this guy. The machine might be a little bit more use with actually transporting characters into melee range with the opponent, particularly handy for anyone who doesn't have a deep strike or fast movement and would otherwise need to foot slog it up the board. One of the main decisions that you need to make with this thing is what sort of things you're going to be putting inside it. There really are quite a lot of good options. I think that Centurions are a really good idea, seeing as it can transport a full squad of them, which is rarely the case with other transports. It's Terminators, which it is supposed to be the transport for, I'm a little bit less sold on, just because you can deep strike them to get them where they need to go, and in some games that's certainly going to be the better idea. Veteran units are another option. Whether Stern Guard or Vanguard, it's likely to be able to deliver them where they need to go, and they tend to be quite fragile point for point, so are a pretty decent pairing. In terms of stratagems, then you can use Armour of Contempt, which is 1 command point to help shrug some mortal wounds if you are focused with it, as each mortal wound will hit you quite hard on such a big expensive tank. Other than that, and maybe command re-rolling the explosion, there isn't really all that much you'd want to do from the main Space Marine Codex. I do find it a bit of a shame that it can't use Vengeance of the Machine Spirits to auto-explode, or fire a quad las cannon when it dies, but unfortunately the Spartan doesn't have the Land Raider keyword. In general, it's more going to be your other options in the codexes that are going to be a bit more powerful for this. Anything that gets it extra damage or extra durability is usually going to be a win on such a huge unit. So how would I go about using a Spartan in-game then? I've already said that I'd prefer the quad las cannons over the laser destroyers, I'd keep the heavy bolters, and I'd think about sticking a multi-melter or heavy bolter on top. In general, if you're using one of these, you're likely to be using some sort of close-range melee unit that you're trying to get to the opponent, as it is very much a hybrid transport as opposed to a dedicated gunboat. With that being said, depending on the exact matchup, you're likely to be wanting to start this fairly close to the enemy, and trundle it up turn 1 to allow yourself to park in the midfield, and hopefully your units can get out turn 2 and cause some mayhem in the enemy army. I think about running characters alongside or just behind him, somewhere well screened, but where he can still get access to the decent rerolls for those quad las cannons. Unfortunately, as a Lord of War, prepare positions won't have any effect on him, but if you do have any other options for defensive buffs, such as the Ironstone for example in Iron Hands, then it's a very good target for them. Despite being a toughness 8, 2-up save and 20 wound model, he isn't all that durable point for point unfortunately, and dedicated anti-tank fire will bring him down. If assault units are a concern, then it might be a good idea to try and screen out with scouts, so hopefully your assault units get the jump on the enemy ones, rather than the other way round. That being said, against more of a gunline army, the Spartan doesn't have to play anywhere near as cagey as it would if it were a landmaider. You really can move it straight up and be ready to charge the thing in at the slightest opportunity to gain a bit of extra movement and deal some extra damage in close combat with those crushing tracks. I think it is a reasonably likely thing to lose in the first couple of turns, but if you have enough threats then your opponent might let it get through in lieu of shooting something else, and if it does then it can be a very potent threat later in the game, trundling around, blowing up things with quad las cannons, and also getting in the way by blocking movement and making charges. If you ever do get the opportunity to try and pin an enemy unit in combat with it, then that would be absolutely ideal, as it means that you couldn't be shot, but you'll still be able to unload all of its guns on the enemies next turn. This could be particularly handy if you have a White Scars Chapter Master with Master of Snares, or some Black Templars infantry that can do the same trick via a stratagem, and if that fails there's always the chance for tri-pointing. So overall, how good is the Spartan then? Honestly, in terms of firepower, it isn't the worst, though it's most certainly not quite as destructive as things like Quad Las Contemptor Mortis Dreadnoughts, which seem to be some of the optimum choices for Space Marine las cannons these days. You get more las cannons on them, they will hit better, and 3 of those will be tougher than one of this guy. I think to make him worth it you do need to try and use him as a transport capacity, but that is somewhat problematic with the 8th edition transport rules, which just means that you're sort of playing a bit of a turn behind. If you spend a turn trundling him up into the middle of the board, then it gives you a bonus an entire turn to try and neutralise him, or just fall back away from him, so the stuff that he's transporting can't get in range. For me, I do think that the Spartan's a pretty interesting pick in comparison to the standard Land Raiders. He's significantly more expensive, he does get more firepower for that expense, but he doesn't get any meaningful increase in defense, so you're really paying an absolute premium for the rules that stop him getting locked up in close combat and still firing when he's there. At the moment I have to conclude that the Spartan really isn't all that competitive in game, but that doesn't mean it can't be fun to try and use one and get the most out of it if you have one in your collection. It is a very cool model. As always with these big Forge World units, it'll be interesting to see if Games Workshop do anything good with them when they do re-release the Forge World rules, which they have said they'll be doing sometime in the not too distant future. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with this guy, and I'll certainly be on the lookout for it when it happens. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you've enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe for more. I'm sure we'll be covering plenty of other Forge World stuff in the future. If you've been watching the channel a fair bit and would like to support the creation of the new videos, then please give a look to the channel Patreon page, which is down in the description below. It is the thing that allows me to spend all the time making these videos, and I wouldn't have the time to be able to keep up this crazy release rate without being able to cut back on my hours of work, which is what the Patreon has allowed me to do. As well as supporting the content of new videos, channel Patrons get to see some early, vote on what's coming next for new videos for the channel, and there's the occasional prize draw where I post out some miniatures to one Patreon. If any of that sounds interesting, or you'd just like to keep these videos coming, then please give it a look. The link is down below in the description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.